Today we're going to look at the factors that cause flooding. So what are the things that cause rivers to overflow their banks and flood? Rivers flow in a river channel, and the amount of water in the river channel is called a river's discharge. A river has a certain amount of water that it can carry before it floods. If there is too much water, or in geography would say, if the discharge is too high, the river overflows its banks and it floods the land around it. And there are several factors that increase the risk of a river flooding. When we talk about risk, we're talking how likely is something to happen. So sometimes on the weather forecast they say the likelihood of rain today is 10%. That means that there is a 10% risk that rain is going to happen. When it comes to rivers and floods, we can't specifically say the percentage of the risk, but we would just say if certain things happen, there will be a high risk of flooding. So let's look at those things that cause a high risk of flooding. Here is our river valley. If there is a lot of precipitation, a high volume of precipitation, that precipitation is going to fall onto the land. Some of that will flow into the soil. When water flows into the soil, it's called infiltration. Infiltration. So some of the water will flow into the soil, but some of the water will flow over land. When water flows over the land or on the surface, it's called surface runoff. So if there is a high volume precipitation, there is going to be more surface runoff. If that rain is prolonged, so it happens for a long time, eventually there is so much water in the soil that new rain falling can't infiltrate because the soil is already full of water. I've said before that infiltration is like when you've got your cereal in your bowl and you're putting in the milk. The milk flows in between the gaps in the cereal. In the soil, the water flows in between much smaller gaps in the soil. If you keep adding if you keep adding milk to your breakfast cereal, your bowl will overflow. If you keep adding water to the soil, the water can't infiltrate into the soil anymore, it's going to overflow and there will be more surface runoff. When the ground is so full of water that the water can't infiltrate anymore, we call that ground saturated. So if there is rain for a long amount of time, prolonged precipitation, the ground becomes saturated and that increases surface runoff. Equally, if there is a prolonged period of high temperature, the soil becomes really dry. And when soil is dry, those air gaps get smaller. And it becomes impermeable. That means impermeable. That means it doesn't let any water through anymore. So when it eventually rains after a period of really high temperatures, the rain falls onto the dry, impermeable soil, and it can't infiltrate into the soil because the soil is now impermeable. So it has to flow over the ground as, tell your screen what we call it when water flows over the ground. Surface runoff. Well done. Surface runoff. to the sides of the valley. So if we have a very flat valley, like I've just drawn here, water lands on the ground and it flows very, very slowly down to the river. That gives it lots of time to flow into the soil. What do we call it when water flows into the soil? Tell your screen. Infiltration. So when the land is flat, there is more infiltration. However, if the land is really steep and it rains, the water flows very, very quickly as surface runoff into the river, and it doesn't have time to infiltrate into the soil. So we've gone over 4 physical factors that increase the risk of flooding. High volume of precipitation, steep slopes, saturated soil, which makes the soil impermeable, and prolonged high temperatures, which also make the soil impermeable. There are some physical factors that can reduce the risk of flooding. If you have little precipitation, there's not much water flowing over the land as surface runoff, and therefore the discharge of the river, the amount of water in the river, will remain low. If you've got flat land, there's more time for the water to infiltrate, so more water soaks into the soil, less water flows as surface runoff, and the risk of flooding is lower. Another factor that affects flood risk is the amount of vegetation in the area. If there is an area with lots of vegetation, vegetation means plants, so here I've drawn some trees. That vegetation will intercept the rain. We call that interception. So rain falls and it lands on the trees, and that slows down the rain, stores some of the rain, and means that there is less surface runoff. If the soil, another factor is that if the soil is permeable, so it's not impermeable, it's permeable, then more water will infiltrate into the soil and there'll be less surface runoff. So impermeable means it doesn't let water through. Permeable means it does let water through. So there are 3 factors that can decrease the risk of flooding. If there is little precipitation, if the land is flat, if there is lots of vegetation, and if the soil is permeable, so sandy soils tend to be more permeable, there will be less risk of the river flooding.